Oh hi, Dave Rome here. If you're hearing this, then you're on the free feed of the Escape Collective podcast network. We're happy you're here, and we'll continue to give plenty of expert opinion and analysis away for free. But really, our best stuff is saved for members of Escape Collective. After all, with no advertising or affiliate links, it's our members who make this all possible. From in-depth interviews with leading experts, to class-leading reviews, through to unique things like my threaded series for anyone spinning spanners of any level. That's the sort of content you'll get by becoming a member. And as an added bonus, you won't have to listen to ads like this again. Head to escapecollective.com/join to sign up.
You're continuing to sell a product that's a garbage product that is terrible at doing the thing it's supposed to do, and it's terrible, and you're continuing to do it. And so it's like you're selling a terrible product to your customers, also toxic in environment. I mean, I just like, I feel like a jerk, but like, I don't have words for this. Like, that should be criminal.
Hello and welcome to a special podcast episode from Escape Collective. I'm Suvi Loppanen, and this is the audio version of a recent investigative piece I published on the topic of PFAS. You've probably seen this acronym, which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's been in the headlines and it's often linked to waterproof clothing. But the issue actually goes far beyond just the clothing. These chemicals are everywhere. They're in the rain jacket that you pack in your back pocket, chain lubes, electronics, in our waterways, and even in our bodies. PFAS are commonly called forever chemicals, and that is because they don't break down. They persist in the environment and they build up in the human body and have been linked to several health conditions, including cancer, hormone disruption, and immune system damage. Now, forced by regulations, there is a shift to PFAS-free alternatives happening in the cycling industry, but this is not without its challenges. In this episode, you'll hear from industry insiders, scientists, and legal experts that I spoke with about the fight to phase out PFAS, the pushback from manufacturers, and what it really means to be PFAS-free. Before we dive in, a quick note though. If you're not an Escape Collective member, then this episode will cut off about halfway through. The kind of in-depth reporting that this story is all about is made possible by our members, and if you want to support that, and listen to this podcast in full, then do consider signing up on our website. Performance versus sustainability, the PFAS dilemma. As bans on toxic forever chemicals take effect, brands admit that the cycling industry has a long road ahead to clean up. That windshell that you pack as insurance, or the chain loop that keeps your drivetrain silent, there's a good chance that both of these contain PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as forever chemicals. PFAS have been a staple of the outdoor and cycling industries for decades, but now that regulations are pushing these chemicals out, the industry is facing an uncomfortable truth. They had relied on these chemicals to achieve a certain performance. And while the PFAS-free alternatives have been met with enthusiasm, they have also been criticized for not performing as well, especially when it comes to the waterproof membranes and DWR coatings, where PFAS have been heavily used. Today, it's also clear that consumers want sustainability, which has made slapping a PFAS-free label on products an effective marketing tool, even though it turns out that achieving something that is 100% PFAS-free is actually nearly impossible.
What do we mean when we say PFAS-free? If you're saying yours are PFAS-free, well, which ones are you including in your definition of PFAS, and at what levels is it there? So it becomes incredibly confusing for the consumer.
Speaking there was Robert Bilott, quite a famous American environmental lawyer who has been working with PFAS litigation cases for decades. We're going to unravel what he's referring to there, but in a nutshell, PFAS is not just one chemical. It's a massive group of different types of chemicals, and they have been overused in all industries for decades. The overuse and the sheer number of PFAS are some of the key issues when it comes to these chemicals. Here's Ian Martin from the Canadian clothing brand 7Mesh.
Everybody's using PFAS chemicals, including everybody. Every paint company, like I said, every tire company, every computer company, everyone's using them. And the question is, what do we do as we phase out of them and try to get away from them?
But before we start to answer those bigger questions about the industry and the shift away from PFAS, let's start with a little definition of PFAS. I asked Stefan Posner, who's an independent Swedish polymer and textile chemist who has worked with PFAS for decades, how would he define PFAS?
Next question, please. No, what is a PFAS? Well, to explain it, you need some fraction of chemistry. And the organic chemistry?
Not too well, no.
The carbon chemistry.
To save you from the very good chemistry lesson that Posner was kind enough to give to me, let's just say that PFAS are a really complex group of synthetic chemicals that feature carbon and fluorine atoms. They are linked together. There's almost 15,000 distinct PFAS substances known to be in use. The definition of this number varies. The sheer number of them also makes them extremely difficult to regulate. And what makes them so effective in things like stain resistance or water repellency or chain lubricants is exactly that carbon-fluorine bond, which also makes them incredibly persistent in the environment, and that earns them the nickname forever chemicals because in essence, these chemicals never go away. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? Well, it actually is, because it's also been proven scientifically that some of these PFAS chemicals that have been studied, many of them haven't even ever been studied, can cause quite negative health impacts in all living creatures. Stefan was explaining to me that some of that is because they are attracted to these proteins in our bodies.
This attraction between proteins and these PFAS make them toxic because a number of these proteins are transporters of important chemical signals in living organisms, and they are blocked.
PFAS were really commercialized in the 1950s by two major companies, DuPont and 3M. If you watch the movie Dark Waters, you'll be familiar with the former at least. But both companies were early adopters who began manufacturing, developing and selling these chemicals for various applications. Relatively soon after PFAS were actually discovered, there were already some findings that they are causing negative health impacts to living organisms. But this didn't stop the companies from producing and selling them. No, it took decades before any wider bans on any PFAS were introduced because of the health effects such as cancer, liver and thyroid issues, and birth defects that were linked back to the exposure to these chemicals. And owing to both this long life they have and the very generous use, nearly a century later, these chemicals are still found in a breathtaking array of products and in our environment. From rain jackets and non-stick cookware to electrical devices, smartwatches, food packaging, anything you can really think of. And in terms of that environmental pollution, they have spread across substantially every surface on Earth, being detected on top of high mountains and in waterways worldwide, including the deep ocean. The nature of these chemicals means that pretty much every PFAS molecule that has been produced since the late 1930s is still out there. This has kind of led into a world where nothing is truly free of PFAS because they just linger around and they cover pretty much all surfaces that we touch.
There is nothing called PFAS-free because you have contamination. And I got that question a number of times, and what is the closest you can get, Stefan, is free from intended use of PFAS.
Yeah,
that's the closest you can get. Because everything you touch contains PFAS. Then, of course, it's detectable with those test methods we have. That's another story. But you cannot say I don't detect it, then it's not there. That's a very easy approach to testing. Mm-hmm. Then you can put the testing limit very high and you don't find anything. That's more or less talking about, does God exist?
What Posner pointed out there applies to the cycling industry as well. And even though a lot of the conversation revolves around waterproof clothing, the issue is a lot more widespread. Almost anything that has stain-resistant, waterproof, heat-resistant, or very durable properties involves PFAS in some way. Chain lubricants are one of those. I talked about this with Josh Portner, who's the founder of accessory and maintenance brand Silka.
The problem I think certainly for America, which becomes the world's problem, is that, we just, I think, got lazy and we used it everywhere, right? And so before you know it, we're coating the McDonald's hamburger wrappers in this stuff so the cheese doesn't stick to it. I mean, it's just like an insanity. And of course, all before anybody even thought to try to figure out if it was toxic, your Teflon chain lube flaking off onto the road and then getting washed into the water. I mean, that's happening, but that's tiny compared to the supply chain effects.
When it comes specifically to chain lubes, PFAS have been long used in them and valued for reducing friction and increasing durability in extreme conditions. But like in many industries and applications, PFAS were adopted without any further consideration for their necessity in everyday applications. PFAS became a standard in chain lubes years ago. A study conducted in 2022 by the Danish consumer ombudsman Tank actually tested 27 bicycle chain lubricants for PFAS content. And the results highlighted that nearly half of these tested lubes contained measurable levels of PFAS, including some of them that were not explicitly even marketed as containing that. But in terms of performance, it's also come out that there's little to defend the use of PFAS. Independent testing has repeatedly shown that many PFAS-containing lubes actually perform worse than the non-PFAS alternatives. And this is what Josh Portner thought about this.
And now I'm just pissed, right? Because you're continuing to sell a product that's a garbage product that is terrible at doing the thing it's supposed to do, and it's terrible for humans and animals and the planet. Like, if you're selling me Krytox to put in a satellite, and you're like, hey, there's no other grease that can handle the 600 degrees Celsius temperature swing and the vacuum of space, I'm like, well, I get that, right? I mean, we don't want to, we don't want to send the Mars rover up and have it seize and be broken $5 billion later because we were trying to eliminate a gram of PFAS from it. But when it's a use case where it is demonstrably, provably a worse product, and you're continuing to do it. And so it's like you're selling a terrible product to your customers, also toxic in environment. I mean, I just like, I feel like a jerk, but like, I don't have words for this. Like, that should be criminal.
But chain lubes are not the only place where PFAS is applied to in the cycling industry. It's also in electronics, including e-bike batteries. A recent study actually found PFAS in 15 of 22 smartwatch bands, including Fitbit and Apple, at higher levels than what's typically found in clothing. These findings have actually led to lawsuits against Samsung and Apple with claims that these watch bands actually contain fluoroelastomers, which have polymeric PFAS, despite, for example, Apple officially having a commitment to move away from these chemicals from years ago. The same study also said that there are certain types of PFAS found in these straps that can transfer from the bands to the skin, meaning that these can be absorbed into the body. In response to these claims, Apple said that the Apple Watch bands are safe for users to wear and cited independent lab testing. But for those looking for PFAS-free options, silicone, metal, and canvas bands are probably safer alternatives. But smartwatch bands, they're just part of the problem. Beyond the straps, PFAS are widely used in electronics inside them, thanks to their heat resistance, flame retardancy, and hydrophobic properties that can help the internal electronics of devices to stay protected from sweat, rain, or immersion in water. And the issue is widely recognized as well. Garmin, for example, a major name in cycling computers and fitness wearables, has explicitly banned PFAS from its products. E-bike batteries, they also contain PFAS in notable amounts. Many lithium-ion batteries contain something called PVDF, which is a PFAS polymer again, and it's used as a binder and separator coating. PVDF is also widely used in the electronic vehicle market. So because of that, Ford, which is the car maker, is one of the companies to have acknowledged the challenge. And they've said that, to our knowledge, there is no commercially available technology that exists in the world today which would allow for the production of electric vehicle batteries without PVDF. So they say there's no PFAS-free alternative for this. Whether they'll find one of those alternatives remains to be seen. But it's worth noting here that there are actually exemptions for certain industries when it comes to the use of PFAS. These exempt industries are, for example, medicine and space. But EV and e-bike batteries are not currently included in those carve-outs. And though this is not directly linked to the cycling industry or the lithium-ion batteries, it's quite interesting that PVDF is actually also used in water filtration systems, which means that it is used to basically purify the water that we're going to drink. And unsurprisingly, it is quite heavily lobbied in that industry to be safe.
at some point it goes from ignorance to evil. I'm not the one to say where that line is, but there's not knowing, there's claiming not to know. And then at some point that's just evil. We've just put ourselves in a terrible spot, right? I mean, it's very similar to like the electric car argument, right? It's like, hey, I'm going to replace my 10-year-old Honda Accord with a Tesla. Well, actually, if you could just keep driving your 10-year-old Honda Accord, we're all way better off than like buying the next new thing because it's the next new thing. But a lot of that is just down to us. We just need to stop buying the next new thing, and we need to, it's, my favorite Japanese proverb, right? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And I think that's where we find ourselves with this.
What about the clothing industry then? The transition away from PFAS has been challenging, and the cycling industry as a whole has taken different steps to address it. The clothing industry specifically has battled between performance, public pressure, and industry inertia. For decades, it's relied on these PFAS-infused membranes and waterproof treatments that are now banned. While many brands boast PFAS-free labels, the reality is much more complicated. Cross-contamination is an issue, and performance trade-offs are real, and at the same time, some companies still defend the historical and even current use of chemicals, as Robert Biller agrees.
First of all, you have ongoing attempts to continue to mislead the scientific community, the regulators, lawmakers, and the public. You have active lobbying still continuing to try to, in the U.S., we refer to this as the manufacturing doubt industry. These folks that are hired to keep telling people we don't know enough yet. More science needs to be done. Wait, we don't have enough data. That's just not true. This is sort of a semantics game that's now being played where, as we finally started to crack down on C8s, at least in the U.S., you started to see various products being advertised as PFOA-free, but it didn't mean it didn't have another PFAS in it. And, it's very confusing to the public who doesn't understand the distinction between all these acronyms. They just assume, that means those bad chemicals aren't in it. So it's critically important to know what detection level are we using? What's the definition of PFAS? There is this issue of, we, company A, maybe we didn't intentionally put PFAS in it, but our supplier had added PFAS, or there was PFAS in it. So it ends up in the final product. But whether somebody intentionally added it or not is a huge question. Because a lot of these materials, we now know whether, even with some of these non-C8 materials, believe it or not, some of these things have been shown that they can break down into a PFAS or create a PFAS or generate a PFAS as it breaks down in the environment. So even though it wasn't added, it may nevertheless actually contain a PFAS later down the line or when it gets to the consumer. So incredibly confusing to the public. And it all depends on what definitions you're using.
Gore-Tex, which is the fabric division of W. Al Gore, and Polartec have been the two major material suppliers of waterproof textiles in the cycling industry. When I approached them for an interview, both were really hesitant to discuss the topic beyond providing links to their public-facing web pages. Gore-Tex especially has essentially built its success on EPTFE, which is expanded polytetrafluoroethylene, which is the same base material used in Teflon. In the broad definition, EPTFE is classed as a PFAS, but like many others who have used these chemicals, Gore-Tex long insisted that not all PFAS are the same and that EPTFE is an insoluble, durable, and stable polymer of low concern. Not everyone exactly agrees with this. When I told this to Stefan Posner, he called this positioning as fluoro industry propaganda that cherry-picks data and ignores inconvenient scientific facts. He also said that polymers of low concern, as Gore said, according to the OECD, do not exist and are not verified as a category by OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which Posner works with. He said that you can claim it is stable in its use phase, but what happens when a product is discarded? That's the bigger picture that the industry ignores. Despite the claim that EPTFE, which Gore-Tex developed in 1969, is harmless, the company has been slowly shifting away from PTFE-based consumer products. In 2017, Gore-Tex committed to phasing out PFCs of quote-unquote environmental concern, which is a category it basically created itself. It later then developed EPE, which is expanded polyethylene, which is the membrane that is now marketed as the PFAS-free alternative and has been adopted by a number of cycling brands. And while Gore's consumer apparel fabrics will be PFAS-free by the end of 2025, Gore-Tex will continue to use the previous EPTFE materials in its industrial products such as firefighting gear or expedition gear. When I was speaking with Amy Callan from Gore's External Affairs about why the transition didn't take place earlier, she said, "It is important to note that the term PFAS is a very broad term that speaks to a wide range of materials with very different properties. It was not a widely used acronym in 2017 when we announced our goal to eliminate PFCs of environmental concern from our consumer fabrics portfolio." Now we come to the wording. Gore is very careful with its language around this transition to PFAS-free. Every mention of PFAS-free is accompanied by an asterisk and a footnote made without intentionally added per- and polyfluorinated substances, may contain trace amounts. This is a quiet acknowledgement that contamination will remain a reality for years to come. How about Polartec then? Polartec, by contrast, has seemingly moved faster in eliminating PFAS. By 2021, the American company had removed PFAS from its DWR coatings, and by the end of 2022, it said all its materials were quote-unquote non-PFAS. Karen Beatty, who's Polartec's Global Director of Marketing, told me that these changes were driven by sustainability, evolving regulations, and customer demand. Beatty didn't clarify the company's definition of this non-PFAS, but she did say that Polartec does not purchase any fibers or finishes that are PFAS-based. Everything they buy is non-PFAS. And they have a multifaceted verification system involving their suppliers, internal testing, and third-party validation such as BlueSign and Okotex. What if I told you that basically everything that the industry has actually told you about performance for the last 40 years is wrong? The reality is that cyclists have been sold the idea that more waterproof is always better, the longer-lasting lubes are worth it, and that high performance comes with not much consequence at all. Now, with the upcoming and existing PFAS regulations, they're greeted with a wide range of approaches from the industry. While some brands are transparent about how they have used these chemicals in the past and how they aim to transition away from them, others are choosing to say nothing. For this article, I reached out to multiple cycling clothing brands that either mentioned or didn't mention PFAS on their websites. Those that did not, none provided a comment for me. Castelli is one of those brands that has recently been quite vocal about its shift away from PFAS and using these PFAS-free membranes and DWR coatings. When I was chatting with Castelli's brand manager Steve Smith, he quite openly admitted that for many years, little was known about the harmfulness of these chemicals, even though, some would argue, they've been linked to various health risks as early as in the 1960s.
And to be honest, there wasn't as much awareness around what this stuff really does, and I mean, not as much panic around what it does either. So, today we're probably panicking, maybe rightly or wrongly, but there's a lot more of attention to it now. So, early 2000s up till 2012, we didn't quite realize some of what we were doing with this powerful C8 DWRs that were making everything waterproof, and it was easy to keep people dry. We also used DWR finishing on things like tights so that we could make a pair of tights that was, in fact, throughout the 2010s, we had a lot of success with grouping of products we called rain or shine, stuff that worked really well in all conditions.
If you're hearing this, then that means that you've come to the end of the free version of this podcast episode. If you want to hear the rest of it, and also read the accompanying article, then head over to escapecollective.com to become a member. As always, thanks so much for listening.